Bring Out Your Dead by Endnotes. From Endnotes number 1, October 2008. Quote, "The tradition of all generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. The social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped away all superstition about the past. The former revolutions required recollections of the past in order to smother their own content. In order to arrive at its own content, the revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead." End quote, from Karl Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. If this was true when Marx wrote this passage, when one could only speak of communism in the future tense, it is all the more so of today, now that anarchists and communists can speak of their own histories. Indeed, seem to speak of little else. Marxism itself is now a tradition of dead generations, and even latter-day situationists seem to have difficulty in leaving the 20th century. We write this not from any special infatuation with the present, or any resultant desire to bring communist theory up to date. The 21st century, just as much as the previous one, is formed by the contradiction between labor and capital, the separation between work and life, and the domination of everything but the abstract forms of value. It is therefore just as worth leaving as its predecessor. Yet, the 20th century, familiar to the situationists, its contours of class relations, its temporality of progress, and its post-capitalist horizons, is obviously behind us. We've become bored with theories of novelty, with postmodernism, post-Fordism, and each new product of the Academy, not so much because they fail to capture an essential continuity, but because the capitalist restructuring of the 1970s and 80s is no longer novel. In this preliminary issue of Endnotes, we have assembled a series of texts, basically an exchange between two communist groups in France, all concerned with the history of revolutions in the 20th century. As the texts make clear, the history of these revolutions is a history of failure, either because they were crushed by capitalist counter-revolution or because their victories took the form of counter-revolutions themselves, setting up social systems which, in their reliance on monetary exchange and wage labor, failed to transcend capitalism. Yet the latter is not simply a betrayal, any more than the former was the result of strategic errors or missing historical conditions. When we address the question of these failures, we cannot resort to what-if counterfactuals, blaming the defeat of revolutionary movements on everything: leaders, forms of organizations, wrong ideas, unripe conditions, other than the movements themselves and their determinate content. It is the nature of this content which is at issue in the exchange which follows. In publishing such historical texts, we have no wish to encourage an interest in history per se, nor to celebrate the legacy of the workers' movement. We hope that in considering the content of the struggles of the last century, we will help to undermine the illusion that this is somehow our past, something to be protected or preserved. Marx's dictum reminds us of the need to shed the dead weight of tradition. Strictly speaking, we have nothing to learn from the failures of past revolutions, no need to replay them to discover their errors or distill their truths, for it would, in any case, be impossible to repeat them. In drawing the balance of this history, in taking it to be over, we are drawing a line that foregrounds the struggles of our own time. The two parties to the exchange we are publishing, Traploin and Theorie Communiste, both emerged from a tendency in the early 1970s that, on the basis of new characteristics of the class struggle, critically appropriated the historical ultra-left, in both its German and Dutch council communist and Italian Bordighist varieties, as well as the more recent work of the Situationist International and Socialism au Barbarie. Before we can introduce the texts themselves, we must therefore introduce this common background. From the refusal of work to communization. When Guy Debord wrote "Never Work" on the wall of a left bank alleyway in 1954, the slogan, appropriate from Rimbaud, was still heavily indebted to surrealism and its avant-garde progeny. That is to say, it evoked at least in part a romanticized vision of the late 19th century Bohemia, a world of déclassé artists and intellectuals who had become caught between traditional relations of patronage and the new cultural marketplace in which they are obliged to vend their wares. The Bohemians' negative attitude towards work had been both a revolt against and an expression of this polarized condition. Caught between an aristocratic disdain for the professional and a petty bourgeois resentment of all other social classes, they came to see all work, their own included, as debased. This posture of refusal was rendered political by the Surrealists, who transformed the nihilistic gestures of Rimbaud, Lautréamont, and the Dadaists into the revolutionary call for a war on work. Yet for the Surrealists, along with their unorthodox revolutionaries, e.g. Lafargue, elements of the IWW, as well as the young Marx, the abolition of work was postponed to a utopian horizon on the other side of a revolution defined in its immediacy by the socialist program of the liberation of work, the triumph of the workers' movement, and the elevation of the working class to the position of a new ruling class. The goal of the abolition of work would thus paradoxically be achieved through first removing all of work's limits, e.g. the capitalist as parasite upon labor, the relations of production as a fetter to production, thereby extending the condition of work to everyone. Those who don't work shall not eat, and rewarding labor with its rightful share of the value it produces, through various schemes of labor accounting. This apparent contradiction between means and ends, evinced in the Surrealist troubled relationship with the French Communist Party, was typical of revolutionary theories throughout the ascendant period of the workers' movement. From anarcho-syndicalists to Stalinists, the broad swathe of this movement put their hopes for the overcoming of capitalism and class society in general and the rising power of the working class within capitalism. At a certain point, this workers' power was expected to seize the means of production, ushering in a period of transition to communism or anarchism, a period which would witness not the abolition of the situation of the working class, but its generalization. Thus, the final end of the elimination of class society coexists with the whole gamut of revolutionary means, which were premised on its perpetuation. The Situationist International, SI, inherited the Surrealist opposition between the concrete political means of the liberation of work and the utopian end of its abolition. Their principal achievement was to transpose it from an external opposition mediated by the transition of the socialist program into an internal one that propelled their conception of revolutionary activity. This latter consisted of a radical rethinking of the liberation of work, along lines which emphasized the refusal of any separation between revolutionary action and the total transformation of life, an idea expressed implicitly in their original project of creating situations. The importance of this development should not be underestimated, for the critique of separation here implied a negation of any temporal hiatus between means and ends, thus of any period of transition, as well as a refusal of any synchronic mediations, insisting on universal, direct democratic participation in revolutionary action. Yet in spite of this ability to rethink the space and time of revolution, the SI's transcendence of the opposition between the liberation and abolition of work would ultimately consist in collapsing its two poles into one another, into an immediate contradictory unity, transposing the opposition between means and ends into one between form and content. After their encounter with the neo-councilist group Socialism au Barbarie at the beginning of the 60s, the SI wholeheartedly adopted the revolutionary program of council communism, lauding the council, the apparatus through which workers would self-manage their own production and, together with other councils, grasp the entirety of social power as a finally achieved form of the proletarian revolution. From then on, all the potential and all the limits of the SI were contained in the tension between their call to abolish work and their central slogan, all power to the workers' councils. On the one hand, the content of the revolution was to involve a radical questioning of work itself, and not merely its organization, with the goal of overcoming the separation between work and leisure. Yet on the other hand, the form of this revolution was to be workers taking over their workplaces and running them democratically. What prevented the SI from overcoming this contradiction was that the polarities of content and form were both rooted in an affirmation of the workers' movement and the liberation of work. For although the SI appropriated from the young Marx and the sociological inquiries of Socialism au Barbarie a preoccupation with the alienation of labor, they nonetheless saw the critique of this alienation as made possible by the technological prosperity of modern capitalism. the leisure society potentials for automation, and the battalions of the workers' movement who were capable of both compelling in their day-to-day struggles and appropriating in their revolutionary councils these technical advances. It was thus on the basis of an existing workers' power at the points of production that they saw the abolition of work as becoming possible, both from a technical and organizational standpoint. In transposing the techniques of the cyberneticians and the gestures of the bohemian anti-artists into the trusted, callous hands of the organized working class, the Situationists were able to imagine the abolition of work as a direct result of its liberation. That is, to imagine the overcoming of alienation as a result of an immediate appropriation of the workplace by the workers themselves. In this sense, the SI's theory represents the last sincere gesture of faith in a revolutionary conception of self-management integral to the program of the liberation of work. But its critique of work will be taken up and transformed by those who sought to theorize the new struggles that emerged when this program had entered into irreversible crisis in the 1970s. The latter would understand this critique as rooted not in an affirmation of the workers' movement, but in new forms of struggles which coincided with its decomposition. However, in the writings of Emergence, La Vieille Taupe, Mouvement Communiste, and others, the attempt to overcome a central contradiction of the SI would first be expressed in a critique of formalism, the privileging of form over content, within the ideology of council communism. The critique of counselism. Contrary to the instructions of the SI, the workers who took part in the mass strike of May 68 in France did not seize the means of production, form councils, or try to run the factories under workers' control. In the vast majority of occupied workplaces, workers were content to leave all the organization in the hands of their union delegates, and the latter often had trouble in convincing workers to show up to the occupation assemblies to vote for the continuation of the strike. In the most important class struggles of the ensuing years, e.g. those in Italy, the council form, consistently the epitome of proletarian radicalism in the foregoing cycle, Germany in 1919, Italy 1921, Spain 1936, Hungary 1956, was notably absent. Yet these years, paradoxically, saw a revival of the ideology of counselism, as a perception of an increasingly unruly working class, and the decreasing viability of the old organization seemed to suggest that the only thing missing was the form most adequate to spontaneous and non-hierarchical struggles. In this context, groups like the Workers' Information and Correspondence, ICO, in France, Solidarity in England, Root and Branch in the US, and to some extent, the Opperisti current in Italy, managed to revive an interest in the German and Dutch left, through blaming the old enemies of counselism, all the left parties and unions, all the bureaucrats in the language of the SI, for the failure of each new insurgency. It would not take long for this perspective to be challenged, and this challenge would initially take the form of a revival of the other left communist tradition. Under the intellectual leadership of Amedeo Bordiga, the Italian left had long criticized council communism, which they thought had been unfairly lumped together with the Italian left and Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder, for its championing of form over content, and its uncritical conception of democracy. It is this critique, filtered through the influence of the dissident Bordigist journal Invariance, which underlies Gilles Dauvet's analysis of counselism in Leninism and the ultra-left, one of the foundational texts of the tendency we are describing. Dauvet accuses council communism of formalism on two accounts. Their approach to the question of organization sees the form of organization as a decisive factor, and inverted Leninism, and their conception of post-revolutionary society transforms the form, the council, into the content of socialism, through depicting the latter as fundamentally a question of management. For Dauvet, as for Bordiga, this was a false question, for capitalism is not a mode of management, but a mode of production, in which managers of any sort, capitalists, bureaucrats, or even workers, are merely the functionaries through which the law of value is articulated. As Pierre Nachal, La Vieille Taupe, and Carsten Jules, Invariance, would later argue, the preoccupation with form over content effectively replaced the communist goal of the destruction of the economy with a mere opposition to its management by the bourgeoisie. Critique of work, redux. In itself, this critique of council communism could only lead to reworking the canonical thesis of the Italian left, either through an eminent critique, invariance, or by developing a sort of Italo-Germanic hybrid, mouvement communiste. What provided the impetus for a new conception of revolution and communism, as communization, was not simply an understanding of the content of communism derived from a close reading of Marx and Verdiga, but also the influence of a whole wave of class struggles of the late 60s and early 70s, which would give a new meaning to the refusal of work as a specific content of the revolution. By the early 1970s, journalists and sociologists began to speak of a revolt against work, afflicting an entire new generation of workers in traditional industries. With rapidly rising rates of absenteeism and sabotage, as well as a widespread disregard for the authority of the union, commentators variously blamed the feeling of expendability and insecurity brought about by automation, the increasing assertiveness of traditionally oppressed minorities, the influence of anti-authoritarian counterculture, the power and sense of entitlement afforded by the prolonged post-war boom and its hard-won social wage. Whatever the reason for these developments, what seemed to characterize the new struggles was a breakdown in the traditional forms through which workers sought to gain control over the labor process, leaving only the expression of an apparent desire to work less. For many of those who had been influenced by the SI, this new proletarian assault was characterized by a refusal of work, shorn of the techno-utopian and bohemian artistic elements which the SI had never been able to abandon. Groups like Negation and Communist Intervention argued that it was not only the power of the Union which was being undermined in these struggles, but the entire Marxist and anarchist program of the liberation of work and the triumph of workers' power. Far from liberating their work, bringing it under their own control, and using it to seize control of society through self-managing their workplaces, in the French May and subsequent creeping May in Italy, the critique of work took the forms of hundreds of thousands of workers deserting their workplaces. Rather than an indication that struggles hadn't gone far enough, the absence of workers' councils during this period was thus understood as an expression of a rupture with what would come to be known as the old workers' movement. The concept of communization. Just as it had been influential in spreading the above-mentioned critique of counselism, the dissident Bordigist journal Invariance was an important forerunner of critical reflection on the history and function of the workers' movement. For Invariance, the old workers' movement was integral to a development of capitalism from a stage of merely formal to one of real domination. The workers' failures were necessary since it was capital that constituted their organizing principle. Quote, "The example of the German and above all of the Russian revolutions shows that the proletariat was fully capable of destroying a social order which presented an obstacle to the development of the productive forces, and thus to the development of capital, but that at the moment that it became a matter of establishing a different community, it remained a prisoner of the logic of the rationality of the development of those productive forces, and confined itself within the problem of managing them." End quote. Thus a question that for Bordiga had been one of theoretical and organizational error came for Kamat to define the historical function of the workers' movement within capitalism. The self-liberation of the working class meant only the development of the productive forces, since the principal productive force was the working class itself. One did not need to follow Kamat into the wilderness in order to agree with this estimation. After all, by the 1970s it was clear that in the East, the workers' movement had been integral, at least at the beginning, to an unprecedented rise in the productive capacity of the socialist states. Whilst in the West, workers' struggles for better conditions had played a key role in bringing about the post-war boom and the resulting global expansion of the capitalist mode of production. Yet for many, the crisis of the institutions of the workers' movement in the 1970s showed that this capitalist function was itself coming into crisis, and workers would finally be able to shed the burden of this history. Thus, for Mouvement Communiste, Negation, Intervention Communiste, and others, the breakdown of the old workers' movement was something to be celebrated, not because the corrupt leadership of the workers' organizations would no longer be able to restrain the autonomy of the masses, but because such a shift represented a transcendence of the historical function of the workers' movement, a transcendence that would mark the reemergence of the communist movement, the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. and did so in an immediate sense, for the riots and wildcat strikes of that decade were read by these groups as a refusal of all the mediations of the workers' movement, not in favor of some other more democratic mediation like that of workers' councils, but in a way that posed the immediate production of communist relations as the only conceivable revolutionary horizon. Thus, whereas communism had previously been seen as something that needed to be created after the revolution was now seen as nothing other than the production of communism, abolishing wage labor and the state. Such groups thus followed the SI in rejecting any notion of a period of transition, but rooted this rejection not in an artistic ideal of unmediated experience, but in the lived reality of contemporary class struggle. In a recent text, Dave sums up this estimation of the old workers' movement. Quote, "The workers' movement that existed in 1900, or still in 1936, was neither crushed by fascist repression nor bought off by transistors or fridges. It destroyed itself as a force of change because it aimed at preserving the proletarian condition, not superseding it. The purpose of the old labor movement was to take over the same world and manage it in a new way, putting the idle to work, developing production, introducing workers' democracy, in principle at least. Only a tiny minority, anarchist as well as Marxist, held that a different society meant the destruction of state, commodity, and wage labor, although it rarely defined this as a process, rather as a program to put into practice after the seizure of power." End quote. Against such a programmatic approach, groups like Mouvement Communiste, Negation, and La Guerre Sociale stood for the conception of revolution as the immediate destruction of capitalist relations of production, or communization. As we shall see, the understanding of communization differed between different groups, but it essentially meant the application of communist measures within the revolution. As a condition of its survival and its principal weapon against capital, any period of transition was seen as inherently counter-revolutionary, not just insofar as it entailed an alternative power structure which would resist withering away, i.e. anarchist critiques of the dictatorship of the proletariat, nor simply because it always seemed to leave unchallenged fundamental aspects of the relations of production, but because the very basis of workers' power on which such a transition was to be erected was now seen to be fundamentally alien to the struggles themselves. Workers' power was just the other side of the power of capital, the power of reproducing workers as workers. Henceforth, the only available revolutionary perspective would be the abolition of this reciprocal relation. Communization and cycles of struggle, Traploin and Theorie Communiste. The milieu in which the idea of communization emerged was never very unified, and the divisions only grew as time went on. Some ended up abandoning whatever was left of the council's rejection of the party, and returned to what remained the legacy of the Italian left, congregating around atavistic sects such as the International Communist Current, ICC. Many others took the questioning of the old workers' movement and the idea of workers' councils to require a questioning of the revolutionary potential of the working class. In its most extreme form with the journal Invariance, this led to an abandoning of the theory of the proletariat, replacing it by a purely normative demand to leave this world, a world in which the community of capital has, through real domination, supplanted the human community. Yet even among those who didn't go as far, there was an abiding sense that as long as struggles remained attached to the workplace, they could only express themselves as a defense of the condition of the working class. In spite of their different approaches, Mouvement Communiste, La Guerre Sociale, Negation, and their descendants ended up affirming the workplace revolts of the 1970s, and the growth of struggles around reproduction with which they coincided, to the extent that they seemed to escape the constraints of class identity, freeing the class for itself from the class in itself, and thus revealing the potential for communization as a realization of the true human community. A few people associated with this tendency, notably Pierre Guillaume and Dominique Blanc, would take the critique of anti-fascism, shared to some extent by all those who defended the communization thesis, to an extreme, and become entangled in the Faurisson affair of the late 1970s. Another tendency, represented by Theorie Communiste, hereafter TC, attempted to historicize the communization thesis itself, understanding it in terms of changes in class relations which were in the process of undermining the institutions of the workers' movement and working class identity in general. They would go on to conceptualize this change as a fundamental restructuring the capitalist mode of production in accordance with the termination of one cycle of struggle and the emergence via a successful counter-revolution of a new cycle. The distinguishing feature of this new cycle for TC is that it carries within it the potential for communization as the limit of a class contradiction newly situated at the level of reproduction. Whilst TC developed their theory of the restructuring at the end of the 1970s, others would follow suit in the 1980s and 90s, and the group Traploin, consisting principally of Gilles Dauvé and Carl Nessick, has recently attempted something of that order in Whither the World and In for a Storm. The difference between these conceptions is marked, not least because the latter seems to have been at least partly developed in opposition to the former. The exchange between Theory Communiste and Traploin we are publishing here took place in the last 10 years, and underlying the assessment of the revolutionary history of the 20th century to be found in these texts are different conceptions of capitalist restructuring and opposed interpretations of the current period. The first text, When Insurrections Die, is based on an early introduction by Gilles Dauvé to a collection of articles from the Italian left journal Bilan on the Spanish Civil War. In this text, Dauvé is concerned to show how the wave of proletarian revolts in the first half of the 20th century were crushed by the vicissitudes of war and ideology. Thus, in Russia, the revolutionists sacrificed the civil war and destroyed by the consolidation of Bolshevik power. In Italy and Germany, the workers are betrayed by unions and parties, by the lie of democracy. In Spain, it is again the march to war, to the tune of anti-fascism, which seals the fate of the whole cycle, trapping the proletarian revolution between two bourgeois fronts. Dauvé doesn't address the latter struggles of the 60s and 70s, but it is obvious that judgments from this period, as to e.g. the nature of the workers' movement as a whole, inform his assessment of what was missing in this earlier defeated waves of struggles. In their critique of When Insurrections Die, TC attack what they consider to be Dauvé's normative perspective, in which actual revolutions are counterposed to what they could and should have been, to a never completely spelled out formula of a genuine communist revolution. TC broadly agrees with Dauvé's conception of revolution, i.e. communization, but criticized Dauvé for historically imposing it on previous revolutionary struggles as the measure for their success and failure, and thus a failing to account for the historical emergence of the communization thesis itself. According to TC, it follows that the only explanation that Dauvé is capable of giving for the failure of past revolutions is the ultimately tautological one that they didn't go far enough. The proletarian revolutions failed because the proletarians failed to make the revolution. In contrast, they argue that their own theory is able to give a robust account of the whole cycle of revolution, counter-revolution, and restructuring, in which revolutions can be shown to have contained their own counter-revolutions within them, as the intrinsic element of the cycles they emerge from and bring to term. In the subsequent three texts in the exchange, 2 by Traploin and 1 by TC, a number of controversies are explored, including the role of humanism and Traploin's conception of communization, and the role of determinism in that of TC. Yet for us, the most interesting aspect of this exchange, the reason we are publishing it here, is that it constitutes the most frank attempt we have come across to assess the legacy of the 20th century revolutionary movements in terms of the conception of communism as neither an ideal or a program, but a movement imminent to the world of capital, that which abolishes capitalist social relations on the basis of premises currently in existence. It is in order to interrogate these premises, to return to the present, our starting point, that we seek to analyze their conditions of emergence in the foregoing cycles of struggle and revolution.